afternoon. Police and witnesses say they've heard an explosion as a commercial jetliner was flying over western Indonesia.
And within about 5 seconds, it felt as if we were plunging out of the sky.
It's pulling left hard, sir.
This is the real-life nightmare that confronted 469 people aboard Qantas Flight 32 at 7,000 feet. Within seconds, the Airbus A380 was transformed from a marvel of engineering into a crippled machine, bleeding fuel and littered with over 200 system failure warnings. The pilots faced an impossible choice: risk a catastrophic crash by landing immediately, or gamble on a mid-air breakup by staying up to fix the problems. What followed was a breathtaking 2-hour battle for survival. A story of incredible skill and a hidden manufacturing flaw so small you'd never see it. This is the secret behind the miracle landing that still stuns aviation experts today. A flight can only be as safe as the people in the cockpit, and on the November morning, the crew of Qantas Flight 32 was unlike any other. Together they carried more than 70,000 hours of flying time, a number so high that it was equal to more than 8 years in the air without stopping. This was not just a group of pilots on duty, it was a collection of masters with the kind of knowledge that can only be earned through decades of experience. At the center of this team was Captain Richard Champion de Crespigny. He had logged over 15,000 hours of flight time and had once served in the Royal Australian Air Force. His background in military aviation meant that he was trained to stay calm in chaos and to think with clarity when seconds mattered. For years he had been flying Qantas's biggest jets, but the A380 was a different challenge, a machine so advanced that even the smallest problem could quickly grow beyond control. Supporting him were 2 skilled first officers, Matt Hicks with 11,000 hours and Mark Johnson with 8,000, both brought long careers in commercial aviation. Their role was not only to monitor the systems, but also to act as extra sets of eyes and hands in a cockpit filled with complex instruments. Unlike many flights that operated with only 3 pilots, this one carried 5, and that made all the difference. 2 Czech captains were also present that day, each one with thousands of hours of command experience. Harry Lubin, carrying 20,000 hours of flying, was in training to become a Czech captain himself, while David Evans, with 17,000 hours, was supervising his progress. This meant that even as Captain de Crespigny was flying, his every move was being observed and reviewed, a situation that would normally add pressure, but in this case created a cockpit overflowing with skill. The combined presence of 5 highly experienced pilots was something close to a dream team, and it would soon prove to be the thin line between survival and disaster. Yet the crew was only half the story. The other half was the aircraft itself, the Airbus A380. This was not just another passenger plane, it was the largest commercial airliner ever built. Its wings stretched wider than a football field, and its 4 Rolls-Royce Trent 900 engines produced a level of thrust that could lift a small town into the sky. It carried more than 450 passengers on long intercontinental routes and had become a symbol of safety and modern aviation. For Qantas, which had not suffered a fatal accident since the 1950s, the A380 was the jewel of the fleet, a flying fortress built to inspire confidence. But history shows that even giants can stumble. Every system on the A380 was engineered to the highest standard, yet complexity often hides fragility. And sometimes a single small weakness can spread faster than anyone expects. The crew believed they were guiding one of the safest aircraft ever designed. But they were about to learn that perfection in aviation is always an illusion. So how could a team with such unmatched experience and a plane built to be nearly indestructible face the worst crisis in modern air travel? It was only 5 minutes after takeoff when calm skies over Singapore turned into a battlefield of noise and fear. At 7,000 feet, passengers heard 2 violent bangs from the left side of the aircraft. In the cockpit, alarms lit up across the electronic displays, and the Airbus lurched to the left, a clear sign that something had gone terribly wrong with one of the engines. Captain de Crespigny ordered the jet to hold altitude at 7,400 feet and stabilize at 250 knots, giving his team the chance to take stock of what they were facing. The first signs pointed to engine number 2. The system known as ECAM reported overheating in the turbine, while the auto throttle system failed at the same moment, forcing the pilots to control thrust by hand. Almost instantly, a brief fire warning appeared, then vanished, leaving only confusion about whether flames had broken out inside the engine. Every second mattered, and the crew had no time to guess. Following the emergency checklist, the first officer pulled back the thrust lever to idle and waited 30 seconds as instructed. Meanwhile, the captain transmitted a pan-pan call to air traffic control, the phrase used when a flight is in trouble but not yet in immediate danger. The message was calm but urgent, telling controllers to prepare for assistance while keeping radio silence so the pilots could focus. The professionalism of this call masked the growing tension inside the cockpit, where uncertainty was quickly building. As the crew attempted to activate the fire extinguishers, another shock came. Neither of the bottles responded, leaving the pilots without confirmation that the flames were being contained. On most flights, this step is routine, but here it was a chilling sign that the failure was deeper than anyone had imagined. What had begun as a single engine issue was starting to feel like a chain reaction spreading across the aircraft. In the cabin, passengers near the windows saw something even more frightening. A gash had opened in the left wing, and fuel streamed into the open air. Some described flashes of flame near the wing root, a nightmare sight for anyone trapped at 30,000 pounds of pressure in a giant tube of metal. Flight attendants tried to reassure people, but fear rippled through the cabin. Calls to the cockpit went unanswered, not because the crew ignored them, but because they were drowning in a flood of system alerts. Inside the flight deck, the ECAM screen kept flashing one warning after another. The pilots counted more than 80 separate alerts in the minutes following the explosion, a workload almost impossible for humans to manage. One by one, they realized that 21 out of 22 major systems had been affected. Hydraulics were leaking, electrical circuits were broken, fuel tanks were losing pressure, and several control surfaces no longer responded. This was the kind of situation no simulator could fully prepare them for, a pilot's worst nightmare unfolding in real time. At that stage, the crew did not know the true cause, only the brutal results. Engine number 2 had torn itself apart, and fragments of metal had pierced the wing and fuel tanks, damaging critical wiring in the process. The damage left the aircraft in a state so fragile that even small mistakes could decide the fate of everyone on board. Yet with 469 lives hanging in the balance, hesitation was not an option. As the jet circled in a holding pattern east of Singapore, the cockpit became a war room of decisions. Should they try to land immediately with an aircraft this wounded, risking collapse on the runway? Or should they stay airborne longer, working through checklist after checklist to understand what was still functional? The captain's calm voice reassured passengers that the plane was stable, but inside the cockpit, the truth was harsher. They were fighting for survival against a storm of malfunctions. Down below, pieces of the shattered turbine had rained over Batam Island in Indonesia. Metal fragments had punctured roofs, smashed into cars, and even struck a schoolyard. By some miracle, no one on the ground was hurt, but news reports quickly spread the rumor that a Qantas Super Jumbo had crashed. For people living under the falling debris, it already felt like a disaster. For those in the sky, it was still unfolding second by second. The minutes stretched into hours as the pilots fought through the chaos. They shut down the ruined engine, rerouted what systems they could, and tried to build a clear mental picture of the aircraft's condition. The truth was sobering. With leaking fuel, broken hydraulics, and reduced roll control, they were now flying an A380 that had lost much of its original strength. Still, the team refused to panic. Experience and training told them that discipline was their only chance. Every decision mattered more than the last. Land too soon and they could lose control. Stay in the air too long and fuel could run dry. It was a razor's edge choice, and the weight of it pressed down on every man in the cockpit. The passengers remained strapped in, watching fuel streak past the windows, wondering whether they were living their final moments. What none of them knew was that the smallest of flaws had started it all, and the chain of destruction was not random at all, but the result of a single hidden weakness deep inside the engine. So what was the secret defect that brought the largest passenger plane in the world to its knees? Behind every dramatic accident, there is often a small hidden flaw, and for Qantas Flight 32, that flaw was buried deep inside the heart of an engine. The investigation revealed that the Rolls-Royce Trent 900 powering the Airbus A380 was not perfect. Inside the engine was a stub oil pipe, a small but essential component designed to carry oil to the bearings that keep the turbine running smoothly. This pipe should have been drilled to precise specifications, yet during manufacturing something went wrong. Instead of being centered evenly, the pipe was bored offline, which left one wall thinner than it should have been. At first, the difference was almost invisible, only a fraction of a millimeter. But in aviation, even the smallest imperfection can set off a chain of failure. With every flight, the pipe endured extreme heat and intense pressure. Metal fatigue began to build where the wall was weakest, and over time, a microscopic crack formed. Each cycle of takeoff and climb widened that crack just a little more until one day it was large enough to change everything. On November 4th, 2010, that thin section of pipe finally gave way. Oil started to leak into the searing hot core of the engine, and within seconds it ignited. The fire spread rapidly, feeding on the constant stream of oil, and soon the temperature inside the turbine rose beyond safe limits. What followed was an uncontained engine failure, the worst kind of disaster for any jet. The intermediate pressure turbine disc, a piece of metal spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, shattered violently. Fragments from the broken disc tore through the protective casing as if it were paper. Some pierced the wing, slicing through the fuel tank and releasing thousands of liters of fuel into the sky. Others cut electrical wires and hydraulic lines, crippling many of the systems the pilots depended on. One piece even ignited vapors inside the wing tank, starting a small fire that burned until it died out on its own. The design had been intended to contain a failure, but the sheer force of the blast was too much to resist. This one weakness, created years earlier in a factory, had now placed hundreds of lives in danger. It also revealed a flaw in the system of oversight. Neither Rolls-Royce nor regulators had caught the misaligned drilling during production. The pipe had passed inspections and entered service, silently carrying its defect through flight after flight until the inevitable moment arrived. It was proof that in aviation, perfection is not only desired, but absolutely necessary. The wider industry felt the shock quickly. The Trent 900 engines powering A380s for Qantas, Singapore Airlines, and Lufthansa were suddenly under suspicion. Rolls-Royce ordered urgent inspections, while airlines grounded parts of their fleets until engineers could be sure the same weakness was not hiding in other aircraft. The discovery shook confidence in what had been seen as the crown jewel of modern jet engines. For passengers, it was a reminder that even the largest and most advanced airliner in the world could be undone by a single crack no bigger than a fingernail. The lesson was stark. It showed how the smallest error in production, multiplied by time and stress, could lead to catastrophe. It also reminded pilots and engineers alike that every flight depends on countless invisible parts working exactly as they should. The chain of failure that nearly destroyed Flight 32 was not caused by bad weather or human error, but by a defect so small it was almost impossible to see. But if the origin of the disaster was now understood, another question remained. How would the crew manage to guide a crippled aircraft with so many broken systems back to the ground safely? When an aircraft suffers damage this severe, survival often comes down to a series of choices, and each one must be made with perfect timing. For Captain de Crespigny and his crew, the first and most important decision was whether to attempt an immediate landing or to remain in the air. The temptation to rush back to the runway was strong, yet the pilots knew that a hasty approach in such an unstable aircraft could lead to disaster on the ground. Instead, they chose to hold altitude and buy themselves time, trusting that the A380 still had enough fuel and that the systems which remained would keep the giant airborne long enough to think. This was where experience spoke louder than instinct. Drawing inspiration from NASA's Apollo 13 mission, the captain urged his team to invert the logic. Rather than wasting energy on what had already failed, they would focus on what still worked. This mental shift allowed the crew to move from panic to problem-solving, building a clear picture of their aircraft's condition, while the sky outside remained calm but deceptive. The process began with assessing the damage they could see. From the cabin windows, a second officer reported holes ripped through the wing and fuel streaming out in a long white trail. The pilots also knew that 8 of the 11 fuel tanks were now useless, leaving them with only 2.5 hours of accessible supply. Even worse, the loss of one hydraulic system had stripped away much of their ability to control roll, the side-to-side banking motion needed to turn. The numbers told a grim story. 65% of their roll authority was gone. Every maneuver from now on would be heavy, slow, and risky. The second great decision was to test whether the wounded aircraft could still be controlled safely at lower speeds. In a normal situation, no captain would risk such experiments during flight, but this was no normal situation. Relying on his military background, de Crespigny commanded a series of checks, moving the control stick to gauge the response of flaps and ailerons. To everyone's relief, the giant machine, though sluggish, obeyed. The trial gave the crew confidence that they could still bring the aircraft down without losing control during the final approach. Calculating the landing requirements was the next step, and it brought another sobering reality. Check Captain David Evans fed the data into the performance computer, but at first the system refused to give an answer. The weight of the aircraft was more than 50 tons above the maximum landing limit. Finally, after adjusting for a dry runway, the program predicted that the jet would stop with only 130 meters to spare on a strip 4,000 meters long. This was not a margin for error. It was a razor's edge that demanded absolute precision. Knowing the odds, the crew requested a 20-mile final approach, twice the normal distance, to give them time to prepare. They needed those minutes to set the abnormal configuration, extend the landing gear manually by gravity, and coordinate with air traffic control. Passengers remained tense but calm as the captain explained the plan, his steady voice masking the storm of calculations and fears that swirled behind the cockpit door. Every step reinforced a single truth: the crew was fighting not just for a safe landing, but for survival itself. Their choices would decide whether the A380 would make history as a triumph of airmanship or a tragedy on the runway. But when the moment came, how would a crippled aircraft with missing slats, damaged flaps, and leaking fuel handle the most dangerous stage of flight, the landing itself? Landing an aircraft is always the most dangerous phase of flight, but for Qantas Flight 32, the challenge was unlike anything most pilots could imagine. The Airbus A380 was no longer in normal shape, carrying battle scars from the engine explosion and facing a series of failures that turned a routine approach into a high-stakes gamble. Every move had to be precise, because the margin for error had almost disappeared. The configuration of the jet was far from standard. Fuel imbalance had made the left wing heavier, forcing the crew to constantly fight the tilt. The slats on the leading edge of the wings refused to extend, while the flaps at the rear could only be lowered partway. This meant the plane could not create the extra lift normally used to slow down safely. The consequence was clear: the aircraft would have to approach the runway at a much higher speed, about 40 miles per hour faster than usual. As the giant drew closer to Singapore, the autopilot was disconnected. Captain de Crespigny gripped the controls and prepared to fly by hand, knowing that the automation was no longer trustworthy. With 3 engines still producing thrust, he balanced power between the outer pair and kept the third engine ready for speed control. Only that engine, number 3, had a working reverse thrust system, which meant it would be their only real tool to slow down after touching the ground. At 800 feet, the descent rate was double what the landing gear was certified to handle. The captain had to make a choice: reduce the rate of descent too early and risk floating above the runway, or allow a hard impact that could break the gear and rupture fuel tanks. In a bold move, he pushed the side stick forward just before the wheels touched, rotating the jet around its center of gravity. This unusual technique created a cushion of air, softened the impact, and gave the landing gear a fighting chance to survive the blow. The wheels slammed onto the tarmac at Changi Airport, and the roar of the engines echoed as the crew deployed everything they had left. Speed brakes opened halfway, the third engine's reverse thrust engaged, and the brakes were pressed to their limits. Passengers gripped their seats as the world outside raced past in a blur of asphalt and emergency vehicles waiting on the sidelines. Finally, the massive aircraft shuddered to a halt, stopping less than 500 feet from the end of the 4,000-meter runway. The cabin erupted with applause, but inside the cockpit, the crew stayed tense. The danger was not over. Sensors showed that the brakes on the left landing gear were burning at more than 900 degrees Celsius, right next to the stream of leaking fuel. Even worse, engine number 1 continued to run despite all attempts to shut it down, its wiring severed from the rest of the system. For 3 long hours, firefighters fought to cool the brakes and drown the rogue engine with foam and water until it finally died out. Only then could the passengers leave the aircraft calmly, walking down the stairs instead of sliding down emergency chutes, a rare ending to what could have been tragedy. The landing of Flight 32 has since been called one of the greatest feats of airmanship in modern aviation, but while the passengers were safe, the story was far from finished. So what kind of shockwaves did this near disaster send through the world of business, aviation, and the companies that built the giant machine? When Flight 32 finally stopped safely in Singapore, the story did not end on the runway. In the days that followed, the shock moved from the cabin to the trading floors of London and Paris, where markets responded with fear. Rolls-Royce, the proud maker of the Trent 900 engines, saw its stock collapse almost instantly. On the day after the accident, shares fell 5.5% to 618.5 pence, the sharpest drop in 18 months. Investors understood what this meant. If one A380 engine had failed in such a dramatic way, others in service might hide the same weakness. The decline did not stop there. By the morning of November 8th, just 4 days later, Rolls-Royce stock had lost more than 10% of its value. It was a stunning blow for a company that had built its reputation on precision and trust. Airbus, then known as EADS, also felt the pain. Its shares fell as concerns spread that the world's largest passenger plane might carry a flaw far more dangerous than anyone had admitted. The aviation industry had been celebrating the A380 as the future of long-distance travel, but suddenly its future looked uncertain. The media described the event as the most serious incident the Super Jumbo had faced since entering service. Experts spoke openly about the rarity of such a failure, with some pointing out that fewer than 5% of engine problems ever involved debris breaking through the casing. The fact that this had happened on a flagship aircraft shocked engineers and passengers alike. Qantas, Singapore Airlines, and Lufthansa were pushed into grounding parts of their fleets, while regulators demanded urgent inspections. The ripple effect went far beyond one flight. It reached into the heart of an industry built on confidence. For passengers around the world, the headlines were more than numbers and percentages. They showed how fragile safety can be when even one part of a system fails. People who had once looked at the A380 as a symbol of strength were now asking if size really meant security. It was a reminder that modern aviation, no matter how advanced, still carried risks hidden in places no one expected. But how did Qantas and Rolls-Royce move forward after such a costly blow? And what did it take to repair not just the aircraft, but also the trust that had been broken? After the headlines and the shockwaves in the markets, the question turned to money and responsibility. Qantas had suffered a crisis that threatened its flagship fleet, and the airline wanted answers as much as it wanted damages. Behind closed doors, months of negotiations took place with Rolls-Royce, the maker of the troubled Trent 900 engines. On June 22, 2011, the settlement was made public. Qantas would receive 95 million Australian dollars, close to 100 million US dollars, as compensation for the disaster that never should have happened. Yet the financial payment was only the beginning of the story. The aircraft itself, the first A380 ever delivered to Qantas and proudly named Nancy Bird Walton, was almost destroyed by the engine explosion. repairs would become one of the most complex restoration projects in modern aviation. The price tag reached 139 million Australian dollars, about 145 million in US currency, and the work would keep the jet grounded for more than 18 months. The scale of the task was staggering. 4 brand new engines had to be fitted, the entire left wing was rebuilt, and over 6 kilometers of damaged wiring were replaced. Engineers in Singapore worked day and night, testing each system with the kind of care usually reserved for a brand new aircraft. The plane was rolled onto the tarmac for repeated ground tests, then pushed into the air for 2 full trial flights before anyone dared to call it safe again. Even after the repairs, the aircraft carried an extra 94 kilograms of weight due to the reinforcements. That detail might seem small, but in aviation, every kilogram counts, and it was a permanent reminder of the scars left by Flight 32. When the aircraft finally returned to Sydney in April 2012, it symbolized not only survival, but also resilience. Passengers boarded the restored Super Jumbo, perhaps unaware that they were stepping onto a machine that had once been on the edge of destruction. For Qantas, the return was proof that even after the most expensive repair in its history, the airline was determined to show confidence in its fleet. But while one aircraft had been saved, the bigger question was whether the entire industry could learn from the hidden crack that had almost caused disaster. This story reveals a powerful truth, that immense danger can be hidden within the smallest of flaws, a lesson that stretches far beyond just airplanes. It was not just advanced technology, but profound human skill, composure, and teamwork that saved 469 lives that day. Captain de Crespigny and his crew's incredible composure under extreme pressure teaches us a crucial lesson about the value of preparation and a lifetime of learning. Their story is a timeless reminder that even when facing overwhelming odds, calm leadership and expert knowledge can defy disaster and create a truly positive outcome from a near tragedy.